So look, we've talked slow down and scale, we've talked customer. I just want to touch briefly on channels and markets and then kind of open up to any questions and grab another coffee as well and we can kind of get up off the stage. But, we talked about the stores and they hadn't had money spent on them and 50% of them and they were really loved in high street as well, in principle, but maybe not in reality in terms of spend. But it costs a lot to go into retail and a lot of brands start D2C. I sometimes think people have forgotten how to do retail a little bit because we've become such D2C experts that the actual human touch and how you have people asking me, oh gosh, how do I go into Selfridges? How do I go into Boots? What do I need? What should the fixtures look like? What's the customer experience when I'm not there and I can't control it? And even virtually you can control it more on D2C, but it does have high costs. So Ian, I wanted to ask you about that. At that stage, your advice, is it the right time to go into retail? What are the considerations financially that you help guide them through?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my experience, and I think I have seen this across customers that you hear about in the market, D2C can only get you to a certain size unless you have a few things present that get that really big wide audience, and that's things like celebrity endorsements and scale to a massive audience that frankly you wouldn't be able to buy or likely wouldn't have the capital to do so if you tried to buy it. So that means that at some point you'll probably hit an upper ceiling of revenue in terms of your D2C distribution. That could be 5 million, that could be 10 million, 20. It does differ for every brand, but eventually you need to expand your go-to-market channels, and distribution is kind of the name of the game, and retail does provide that. Eventually, you want to, and I think Wild is a pretty good example of this, is that it started as a wholly D2C brand, and they grew it to a certain size, and it was working well, but they wouldn't have gotten to be the 100 million a year brand without kind of retail distribution. So it needs to happen eventually. And as Rosie said, there's a really good point around pricing your product from D2C's perspective, and that's looking at something like an 80% margin as a base for your core product, for your hero product. So that means giving yourself somewhere between a product cost of sort of 5 to 10%, I think especially in beauty. So that means you're probably marking your product cost up 10 times. Or somewhere between 5 to 10 times, and that's a pretty simple pricing formula that will allow you to, one, succeed in e-commerce D2C. That gives you plenty of room to fulfill it and sell it through different channels. That's everybody's going to start taking commission, payment fees, but really prepares you to go into retail where you're going to face 50 to 75% discounts. In terms of the retailer margin, and then you're also looking at
staffing, sites,
promotional costs that you're fronting for the retailers. It definitely gets complicated. So in terms of your journey, what I have seen work really well is you get a business to doing sort of 2 million plus a year through D2C and multi-channel e-commerce, but that gives you the margin to cover some operating costs and a team to help you expand into retail. Because the reality is it increases the complexity in your business many times. You have forecasting that needs to be done 12 months out instead of next month. You have to have the cash flow to cover large purchases of inventory up front, because all of a sudden you have this new channel that is going to require much larger portions of product delivered up front, and very likely the retailers are going to squeeze you on payment terms. So what that means is that they're going to buy a whole lot of your stock that you've had to pay up front, and they're probably not going to pay you for somewhere between 30 to 90 days later. So now you need to have cash flow to kind of fund that working capital gap. So I think retail becomes a great strategy for that next stage of growth for your brand. Coming from a place of D2C as your starting point, you probably want to be doing 2 or 3 million a year at least before you expand into that, because there's costs you need to cover and complexity that increases significantly from there.
And I think the other thing that what retailers are looking for is a new audience, always a new audience. So if you've built out a really solid audience, I'm working with Wonderskin at the moment. If any of you looked at that online, it's insane in terms of the virality that they've achieved. And that's why retailers everybody's asking. It's like being at Charlotte Tilbury again. It's never been so easy to sell in a product. In fact, you don't want to sell it into everybody, and that's rare. But if you've created that up front, then it opens up your negotiation. And to your point, if you go in too early, then actually you're kind of at their mercy. And I love a retailer, I was a retailer, but you kind of are. So you really have to know the power of your brand and be able to have that negotiation. And just talking about retailers and markets, Western Europe is not the highest growing market, but Eastern Europe has got some really interesting things going on. But if you look at where growth is coming from, out of that 5%, two of the biggest regions, Middle East and India. And so I just wanted to ask you, Rosie, because you took that step, and it's a scary one. I did it for Charlotte Tilbury, and it was complex.
Yeah.
How about you?
So we launched in the Middle East about a year ago, but I've been working on it for 2.5 years, and it was a complete leap of faith. But I think what we were finding in the UK was that the market was really saturated. And it was hard to break through the noise. Those CPAs were high. And we looked at the US, which was even more saturated, and we thought, let's go east, but not too far east, to the point where, they don't even have websites in China, and it's a totally different thing, even though we are operating there now. So the Middle East made sense. One of my team members moved to Dubai, so I had somebody on the ground over there anyway for family reasons. So I had somebody on the ground there, and I was talking to distributors, and they wanted to take 90% margin up front to literally take the goods and register them and do it all on their own terms, which wouldn't have worked for us. So we decided to set business up over there on our own, and working with Triffin was really the only way that we were able to forecast that and understand our cash flow in the absolute where we were with our cash flow, and ensure that we could make that investment. I personally got residency, we registered all the products and jumped, and it was just like whack-a-mole. I mean, we were just jumping through the hoops that came up in front of us. We didn't know what we were doing, we were just muddling through, but we got there, and we registered all of the products that we launched in Dubai. Now, Dubai is not the Middle East. It obviously is in the Middle East, but it's a tiny fraction of the Middle East, and we look at it as the whole region. And Dubai was just where we started, and we dipped our toe. So we already are working with premier retailers over there, the equivalent of Space NK and Net-a-Porter, Harrods, just to kind of build that foundation. We put a bit into D2C there, but I don't think that that's really...
just emerging.
It's just emerging, and that's not the reason that we're over there. So the strategy was make a bit of noise and then get the right distributor, because there's no way I can take on Saudi and Kuwait and Oman on my own. I'm not going to pretend that I can. And we are now in talks with one of the leading pharma companies in the region who want to be the sole distributor of it across the region, which is exactly what we were trying to do. That's really exciting.
I think that's amazing, because it's really complex, and the fact that you went and did all of that, knowing that that was the only affordable way to do it, it comes back to that perseverance and really having some
you just got to keep the dare to do it,
but do it with support.
And what I would say, it was funny, I was at another talk recently, and it was Rochelle Hughes, and she's got that amazing cocoa brand, Little Cocoa, and she was saying how she launched in Dubai. She's obviously Rochelle Hume, so like Hailey Beaver, she's got that personality anywhere, and good for her. But she said that, and this is exactly what I found, the doors that have been opened for her in the Middle East have just been phenomenal versus in the UK, and we made more ins in 6 months in the Middle East than we had in 6 years here. And I feel like there are a lot of gatekeepers here in the UK. Especially women, but also men, and it's definitely something that I'm trying to change. I found like you go to the Middle East, everybody wants to help you, and I don't know if that's just the vibe over there of an expat community, but it's a nice place to do business.
Yeah, I think there's some complexity there, and it's quite aligned, isn't it, in the UAE in terms of the customer to a degree. It's definitely influenced by UK success. But there is a real hunger and a cultural love of beauty.
To grow together as well.
And there's a cultural love of beauty. It's really, really meaningful.
Yeah.
And it's a really high spend per customer per annum. So it's definitely worth it. And just kind of talking about kind of the last question really, I think because of the time, is the other emerging market that's really interesting is India. It's really complex too, and it's at a much lower stage of emergence. But again, culturally, a huge, huge love of beauty. And I think there's some really interesting things happening there. UK brands going to India. And actually, I'm getting asked about India brands coming to the UK. And it's a really big step of consideration, particularly considering what's happening in China. And people are a bit more nervous about going in China.
I was actually with the DBT yesterday. It's obviously the trade deal that we've just done with India, and they're having a mission over to India. So if anyone's interested, get in touch with them, because you can get on there, you can go to India with them, and they're trying to promote British brands over there at the moment.
And I'm going to point out, lady in the room here from British Beauty Council is talking about that as well. So, I think there's a lot of knowledge that you can gain, and the industry can be tricky, but it's quite co-supportive, and there's a lot of resources. Just finally on India, I just wanted to look at that from an investor perspective. Is it a smart move? When and if?
So a lot of people say, well, India is where China was 10, 15 years ago. But I think you need to differentiate. Brands went into China to distribute into China. Space & Care had a China office and stores which we had to close. I used to work for Manzanita Capital, which owns Space & Care. So we had to close it because of a competition with Sephora. So I think brands go into China to get distributed. India, what investors look for is to invest in Indian brands. Unilever invested 5 million in India Wild. You had L'Oreal invested into Indian brands. And what works in India is, however, it's mass. Because Kama Ayurveda is an Indian brand owned by Puig, but it works here. It doesn't work in India. In India, nobody buys Kama Ayurveda. So I think and it's a very, from the distribution, it's a wide canvas. They don't have Sephora's, they don't have and what they have, it's very unsophisticated stores. And so I think it's you can't compare the two at all, because India, there's not a single Chinese brand I know that is available in the West. You have Korea, you have Japan, but there is no made in China for skincare. Does not work.
Yes.
Made in India for skincare works because of the Ayurvedic properties. So I think it's very different. In terms of, so I would say from the investment perspective, look for an Indian brand which you can bring into the UK or in the West. But if it's a Western brand, it has to be really mass. Yeah. It has to be below £5, for the top, because they don't have it's not the Middle East where people spend money. So you just have to,
And I think that's going to change over time. So the answer really is know your market, understand the customer, and there are some interesting forums that you can talk to really get to understand that market. But lots of opportunity, lots of challenges, lots of complexity, and lots of amazing people. So, a huge thank you to Trivin for hosting, and Eliza for your support racing around within a very short period of time, and most definitely to a round of applause for that.